January 17, 1942, Yokosuka Naval Base, Japan. The morning fog clings to the harbor as Rear Admiral Komatsu Teruhisa spreads intelligence reports across his mahogany desk. Steam rises from his teacup, mixing with the cigarette smoke that fills his cramped office overlooking the submarine pens. Outside, the silhouettes of I-class submarines emerge and disappear like ghosts in the mist. His fingers trace the latest assessments from naval intelligence. American submarine capabilities. Patrol duration, estimated 30 to 35 days maximum. Submerged endurance, 24 to 48 hours. Detection range of Japanese hydrophones, 2,000 meters under optimal conditions. The numbers seem reassuring, almost comfortable in their predictability. Komatsu nods to himself, satisfied. The Americans would fight as the Japanese themselves did. Quick strikes against warships, brief patrols, surface operations under cover of darkness. Their submarines, like Japan's own, would be extensions of the fleet, scouts for the decisive battle that would surely come. He closes the folder with confidence. The Empire's merchant shipping, stretching across thousands of miles of Pacific waters, would be adequately protected by existing patrol craft and convoy escorts. After all, no submarine could remain hidden beneath the waves for weeks at a time, stalking prey with the patience of a predator. The fog outside begins to lift, revealing the calm waters of Tokyo Bay. Komatsu has no way of knowing that at this very moment, American submarines are already prowling Japanese waters, their crews prepared for patrols that will last not days, but months. In boardrooms and planning sessions across Japan, naval commanders are making calculations based on assumptions that will prove devastatingly wrong. The Empire's fate hangs on understanding an enemy they have fundamentally misjudged. The Japanese Navy entered World War II with a mindset forged in the crucible of previous victories. The ghosts of Tsushima and the Yalu River haunted every strategic decision, whispering that naval warfare meant one thing: massive fleets clashing in decisive battle. This doctrine wasn't born from arrogance alone, but from genuine success. In 1905, Admiral Togo's fleet had annihilated the Russian Baltic Squadron in a single afternoon, proving that concentrated firepower and superior tactics could determine the fate of empires. For nearly 4 decades, this lesson shaped Japanese naval thinking. Young officers at the Naval War College studied fleet engagements obsessively, dissecting every maneuver from Jutland to the Falklands. But when instructors mentioned the grinding submarine warfare that had nearly strangled Britain during the Great War, eyes glazed over. Commerce protection was tedious work, lacking the glory of ship-to-ship combat. The Japanese officer corps, bred for aggressive action, found convoy escort duty beneath their warrior spirit. This cultural bias ran deeper than mere preference. Japanese naval tradition celebrated the samurai ideal of decisive, honorable combat. Submarines skulking beneath the waves, attacking merchant vessels, seemed dishonorable compared to the clean lines of battleship guns engaging at 20,000 yards. Even when Japanese destroyers assisted British anti-submarine efforts in the Mediterranean during World War I, the lessons learned were quickly forgotten, overshadowed by more exciting surface actions. Budget constraints reinforced these preferences. With limited resources split between Army and Navy, Japanese naval planners focused on building ships that could challenge the American Pacific Fleet directly. Every yen spent on escort vessels or anti-submarine craft was a yen not invested in carriers, battleships, or cruisers. The calculation seemed logical. Defeat the American fleet in battle, and the submarine threat would evaporate. Japanese intelligence compounded these errors by fundamentally misunderstanding American submarine doctrine. Their own submarines operated as fleet auxiliaries, scouting for the main force or conducting hit-and-run attacks against enemy warships. They assumed American submarines would follow the same pattern. The concept of systematic commerce raiding, of submarines prowling shipping lanes for months at a time, simply didn't register in their strategic thinking. The organizational structure of the Japanese Navy reflected these priorities. As war approached in late 1941, only 2 officers in the entire naval general staff bore responsibility for shipping protection and anti-submarine warfare. These duties fell under rear-line defense, considered secondary to offensive operations. No dedicated anti-submarine units existed. Patrol craft handled these missions as additional duties while pursuing their primary roles. Production planning revealed the same blind spot. Japanese shipyards prioritized aircraft carriers, fast cruisers, and powerful destroyers. Anti-submarine vessels were deemed buildable after war was declared, as if submarine warfare would politely wait for Japan to prepare adequate defenses. This assumption would prove catastrophic when American submarines began their relentless campaign almost immediately after Pearl Harbor. The tragedy deepened when considering Japan's growing dependence on seaborne trade. By 1941, the island nation imported 60% of its food and nearly all strategic raw materials. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, rice from Southeast Asia, iron ore from China. Everything flowed across sea lanes that Japanese planners assumed would remain secure. Their confidence rested on the belief that American submarines, like their own, would target warships rather than merchant vessels, leaving commercial shipping relatively unmolested until the decisive fleet action determined the war's outcome. While Japanese admirals studied surface battle tactics, American submarine designers were quietly revolutionizing underwater warfare. The Gaito and Balao-class submarines emerging from American shipyards in 1941 represented a completely different philosophy of naval combat. These weren't fleet scouts or auxiliary warships, but oceanic predators designed for extended independent operations in enemy waters. The numbers told a story Japanese intelligence failed to grasp. American fleet submarines carried provisions for 75 days at sea with fuel capacity for patrol ranges exceeding 10,000 miles. Their battery systems, comprising two massive 126-cell groups, could sustain submerged operations for 48 hours at conservative speeds. More critically, these submarines were built for endurance rather than sprint performance, capable of maintaining station in hostile waters for months while their crews systematically hunted merchant shipping. American submarine doctrine embraced what Japanese tradition rejected: patient, methodical commerce destruction. Naval War College studies in Newport had analyzed the German U-boat campaigns of World War I with clinical precision, identifying the vulnerabilities of island nations dependent on maritime trade. Unlike Japanese submarines, designed to support fleet operations, American boats were optimized for solitary hunting, equipped with sophisticated navigation systems, reliable torpedoes, and crews trained for extended autonomous operations. The technical specifications revealed the magnitude of Japanese miscalculation. Where Japanese submarines typically displaced 1,500 tons and carried 14 torpedoes, American fleet boats weighed over 2,400 tons and bristled with 24 torpedoes. Their robust construction allowed diving depths of 400 feet, far beyond the 200-foot maximum depth settings of standard Japanese depth charges during the war's early years. American submarines weren't just larger, they were fundamentally different weapons designed for a different kind of warfare. Training protocols emphasized this distinction. Japanese submariners learned formation tactics and fleet coordination, preparing to operate as part of larger naval units. American crews drilled endlessly in individual ship operations, torpedo attack procedures, and extended patrol endurance. They practiced remaining submerged for days at a time, conserving battery power and managing air quality in sealed compartments. These weren't theoretical exercises, but practical preparation for the grinding campaign ahead. Intelligence gathering capabilities gave American submarines another crucial advantage Japanese planners never anticipated. Advanced periscopes, sophisticated radio equipment, and detailed charts of Japanese waters allowed American boats to operate with unprecedented precision. They could identify specific merchant vessels, track convoy routes, and coordinate attacks across vast ocean areas. Japanese anti-submarine forces, expecting brief encounters with fleet auxiliaries, found themselves facing systematic predators who knew their waters better than local patrol craft. The industrial capacity behind American submarine construction dwarfed Japanese capabilities. Electric Boat Company and other manufacturers were already expanding production before Pearl Harbor, preparing for sustained submarine warfare on a scale the Japanese Navy had never contemplated. By 1942, American shipyards would launch submarines faster than Japanese anti-submarine forces could adapt their tactics or equipment to counter them. Perhaps most significantly, American submarine commanders embraced unrestricted warfare against merchant shipping from the war's opening days. While Japanese submarines continued targeting warships and military transports, American boats began systematic attacks on tankers, freighters, and supply vessels throughout the Pacific. This strategy, learned from studying British vulnerability to U-boats, aimed directly at Japan's economic lifeline rather than its military forces. The psychological preparation of American crews reflected this different mission. Where Japanese submariners trained for brief, glorious engagements, American sailors prepared for months of tedious patrol punctuated by moments of lethal precision. They learned to live in cramped quarters, manage limited fresh water, and maintain equipment under conditions that would challenge the most experienced peacetime crews. This mental conditioning would prove as important as their technical advantages in the campaign ahead. Japanese naval intelligence, focused on battle line strength and carrier aircraft, missed these fundamental differences entirely. Their reports cataloged American submarine numbers and basic specifications, but failed to recognize the doctrinal revolution these weapons represented. When Admiral Komatsu reviewed those intelligence summaries in January 1942, he saw enemy submarines through the lens of Japanese naval tradition, unable to imagine that American commanders were already implementing a strategy that would strangle Japan's maritime empire one merchant ship at a time. The intelligence blind spot. Japanese naval intelligence operated with methodical precision, cataloging American fleet strengths, monitoring aircraft production, and tracking ship movements across the Pacific. Yet their analysis contained a fatal flaw that would cost the empire dearly. Intelligence officers, trained in the tradition of surface warfare, examined American submarines through familiar frameworks that obscured their true threat. Reports detailed hull numbers, displacement figures, and torpedo loads with bureaucratic thoroughness, but missed the revolutionary operational concepts these weapons embodied. The misunderstanding ran deeper than simple numbers. When Japanese analysts noted that American submarines carried provisions for 75 days, they interpreted this as excessive peacetime luxury rather than operational necessity. Their own submarines, designed for 30-day patrols supporting fleet operations, seemed adequately supplied by comparison. The concept that enemy submarines might spend months stalking individual merchant vessels with methodical patience simply didn't register in minds focused on decisive battle scenarios. Communication intercepts and prisoner interrogations reinforced these misconceptions. Early encounters with American submarines followed predictable patterns: quick attacks, rapid withdrawal, surface escape under darkness. Japanese observers concluded that enemy tactics mirrored their own, confirming existing assumptions about submarine warfare. They failed to recognize that these early engagements represented American crews learning their trade, not the systematic campaign that would follow once commanders gained experience and confidence. The tactical miscalculation, Japanese anti-submarine warfare doctrine, reflected decades of peacetime theory with minimal practical application. Training exercises assumed submarine contacts would be brief encounters resolved quickly through aggressive action. Depth charge attacks followed rigid patterns optimized for destroying submarines caught near the surface, not patient predators lurking at maximum diving depth. The standard depth charge settings of 100 to 200 feet proved woefully inadequate against American submarines routinely operating at 300 feet or deeper. Detection equipment reflected the same limitations. Japanese hydrophones, while reasonably effective within their design parameters, were optimized for locating submarines that behaved like Japanese submarines. American boats, operating with different tactics and superior battery endurance, often remained undetected by equipment designed to catch shorter duration contacts. When detection did occur, Japanese escort commanders typically broke off contact after brief attacks, assuming successful destruction based on minimal evidence. The escort force structure revealed another critical weakness. Rather than dedicated anti-submarine vessels, Japan relied on multi-purpose patrol craft and destroyers diverted from fleet duties. These ships carried anti-submarine equipment as secondary armament, operated by crews who considered submarine hunting an unwelcome distraction from more prestigious assignments. When merchant vessels reported submarine attacks, the response was often perfunctory, lacking the persistence and expertise necessary to locate and destroy experienced American crews. The technology gap. American submarine technology incorporated lessons learned from 2 decades of systematic development, while Japanese countermeasures remained largely theoretical. The battery systems powering American submarines represented a quantum leap in underwater endurance, allowing sustained operations at depths that placed them beyond effective range of Japanese detection equipment. Where Japanese submarines surfaced nightly to recharge batteries and refresh air supplies, American boats could remain submerged for days, emerging only when tactical conditions permitted. Sonar technology revealed another crucial disparity. Japanese echo-ranging equipment, roughly equivalent to American systems from the mid-1930s, provided adequate performance against conventional targets but struggle with the advanced hull designs and sound dampening techniques incorporated into American submarines. The superior acoustic signatures of American boats, combined with their ability to operate at greater depths and reduce speeds, created detection problems that Japanese equipment couldn't solve. Perhaps most critically, Japanese anti-submarine weapons remained unchanged from pre-war designs, while American defensive capabilities evolved rapidly through combat experience. Standard depth charges, effective against submarines operating at shallow depths with limited battery endurance, proved inadequate against targets that could dive deep and remain submerged until pursuit ended. The lack of ahead-thrown weapons like the Allied Hedgehog system meant Japanese escorts had to pass directly over suspected submarine positions, alerting experienced crews to incoming attacks and providing time for evasive maneuvers. The cultural doctrine trap, the Bushido spirit that animated Japanese naval officers, created an unexpected vulnerability in their anti-submarine warfare capabilities. Combat doctrine emphasized aggressive action, decisive engagement, and honorable confrontation between opposing forces. These principles, which served brilliantly in surface warfare, proved catastrophically inadequate against an enemy that embraced patience, stealth, and methodical destruction of non-combatant targets. Japanese escort commanders, trained to seek glorious battle, found themselves psychologically unprepared for the grinding persistence required to hunt submarines effectively. This cultural bias manifested in tactical decisions that consistently favored American submarine crews. When depth charge attacks failed to produce immediate results, Japanese commanders typically declared victory and departed rather than conducting prolonged searches. The concept of spending hours methodically quartering search areas, dropping patterns of charges at varying depths, conflicted with ingrained preferences for rapid, decisive action. American submarine commanders quickly learned to exploit this predictability, knowing that Japanese escorts would abandon contact after brief, intensive attacks. Training programs reflected these doctrinal limitations. Japanese anti-submarine schools emphasized quick identification and immediate attack rather than the patient tracking skills necessary for effective submarine hunting. Officers learned to recognize periscope sightings and torpedo wakes but received minimal instruction in acoustic tracking, depth estimation, or sustained pursuit techniques. When confronted with American submarines that avoided surface detection and operated primarily through passive sonar contact, Japanese crews found themselves technically unprepared for prolonged underwater combat. The Merchant Marine Massacre. By mid-1942, American submarines had identified the fatal weakness in Japanese maritime strategy. Merchant vessels traveled predictable routes with minimal escort protection, their schedules known weeks in advance through captured documents and signal intelligence. The Maru fleet that sustained Japan's Pacific Empire moved with peacetime regularity, presenting targets that experienced submarine commanders found almost impossibly easy to intercept. Individual attacks revealed the systematic nature of American tactics. The tanker Kyokudo Maru, torpedoed east of Formosa in March 1942, represented the first of thousands of similar encounters. USS Wahoo, under Commander Dudley Morton, stalked the vessel for 6 hours before attacking, demonstrating the patient approach that Japanese anti-submarine forces couldn't counter. The submarine remained in the area for 3 days after the sinking, intercepting rescue vessels and ensuring complete destruction of both ship and cargo. These methodical hunting patterns created cascading effects throughout Japan's logistics network. Supply schedules, carefully calculated to support military operations across the Pacific, began collapsing as ships simply disappeared between ports. Replacement vessels, hastily pressed into service from civilian roles, lacked proper defensive equipment and experienced crews familiar with wartime conditions. The merchant marine death spiral had begun, each sinking making subsequent voyages more dangerous as remaining ships carried increasingly vital cargoes over longer, more circuitous routes. The detection failure cascade, Japanese hydrophone networks constructed during the 1930s to provide early warning of enemy fleet movements, proved completely inadequate for tracking systematic submarine operations. The fixed listening posts, designed to detect large surface formations approaching Japanese waters, couldn't track individual submarines operating with sophisticated noise discipline throughout the Pacific. American boats learned to exploit blind spots in the detection grid using bathythermographic layers and underwater terrain features to mask their acoustic signatures. Mobile detection platforms suffered from equally fundamental limitations. Japanese patrol aircraft equipped with primitive radar and magnetic anomaly detectors covered vast ocean areas with minimal effectiveness against submerged targets. The few aircraft equipped with both radar and MAD systems lacked sufficient range to patrol the extended sea lanes where American submarines operated most effectively. When detection did occur, communication delays and inadequate coordination between air and surface units typically allowed submarines to escape before effective attacks could be mounted. The failure extended to basic intelligence gathering about submarine operations. Japanese naval intelligence focused on tracking American fleet movements and aircraft deployments, paid minimal attention to submarine patrol patterns and operating areas. They failed to recognize that American boats were conducting systematic reconnaissance of Japanese waters, mapping defensive positions and identifying optimal attack routes for future operations. This intelligence blindness meant that even successful anti-submarine actions provided no useful information for predicting future attacks or improving defensive measures. Surface escorts compounded these failures through inadequate equipment maintenance and poor tactical coordination. Many vessels carried defective sonar systems that provided unreliable contact information, while crews lacked sufficient training to distinguish between submarine contacts and false returns from marine life, thermal layers, or underwater debris. The resulting confusion led to numerous attacks on phantom targets, while actual submarines observed from nearby positions, learning Japanese tactics and timing their own attacks to exploit observed weaknesses in defensive patterns. August 1943, the escalation. The summer of 1943 marked the moment when American submarine warfare transformed from harassment to systematic strangulation. Commander Dudley Morton's USS Wahoo emerged from the Sea of Japan after her fourth patrol, having sunk 4 merchant vessels and a passenger liner in waters the Japanese considered absolutely secure. The psychological impact rippled through naval headquarters in Tokyo as staff officers struggled to comprehend how enemy submarines had penetrated their inner defensive perimeter with apparent impunity. Morton's patrol report, intercepted through Japanese code-breaking efforts, revealed the terrifying efficiency of American operations. The Wahoo had remained submerged for 18 consecutive days while stalking targets, surfacing only briefly at night to recharge batteries and transmit position reports. This endurance exceeded every Japanese estimate of American submarine capabilities by a factor of 3. Intelligence analysts, confronted with evidence that contradicted fundamental assumptions about underwater warfare, initially dismissed the reports as American propaganda designed to demoralize Japanese merchant marine crews. But the evidence accumulated relentlessly. USS Silversides, operating in the South China Sea, sank 6 vessels during a single patrol lasting 71 days. USS Drum, prowling the approaches to Rabaul, destroyed 8 merchant ships while remaining completely undetected by Japanese anti-submarine forces. These weren't isolated successes, but systematic campaigns conducted with industrial precision. American submarines were treating Japanese merchant shipping like a production line, processing targets with methodical efficiency that Japanese naval doctrine had never anticipated. The numbers told an increasingly desperate story. By September 1943, Japanese merchant losses exceeded replacement construction by 40%. Shipyards, struggling with material shortages and competing priorities, couldn't build vessels fast enough to replace those destroyed by submarine action. More critically, experienced merchant marine officers were dying faster than training programs could replace them. Each sinking removed not just tonnage but irreplaceable expertise in navigation, cargo handling, and maritime operations essential to maintaining Japan's Pacific logistics network. The tactical revolution. American submarine commanders had discovered that Japanese anti-submarine measures designed for brief encounters with fleet auxiliaries proved completely inadequate against patient predators operating with superior endurance and detection equipment. USS Tang, under Commander Richard O'Kane, demonstrated this tactical revolution during her October patrol off the China coast. Rather than conducting hit-and-run attacks, Tang methodically stalked a 6-ship convoy for 4 days, positioning herself for simultaneous attacks on multiple targets. The attack itself revealed how completely American tactics had evolved beyond Japanese countermeasures. Tang fired torpedoes at 3 separate targets from a single firing position, then dove to 400 feet and waited motionless while Japanese escorts conducted frantic but futile searches overhead. The depth charges, set to detonate at 200 feet maximum depth, exploded harmlessly above while Tang's crew monitored the chaos through passive sonar. After 6 hours of unsuccessful searching, the escorts abandoned the area, allowing Tang to surface and assess the destruction of 3 merchant vessels totaling 15,000 tons. This pattern repeated across the Pacific as American submarine commanders recognized that Japanese anti-submarine doctrine created predictable vulnerabilities they could exploit systematically. Escort vessels invariably approached submarine contacts at high speed, making excessive noise that allowed submarines to track their movements acoustically. Depth charge attacks followed standard patterns that experienced submarine crews learned to anticipate and evade. Most critically, Japanese escorts consistently abandoned contacts after brief, intensive attacks, allowing submarines to remain in productive hunting areas for weeks at a time. The psychological warfare aspects intensified as American submarines began deliberately taunting Japanese anti-submarine forces. USS Harder, commanded by Sam Dealey, developed tactics specifically designed to draw destroyer attacks, then counterattack with torpedoes while the destroyers were committed to depth charge runs. This reversal of traditional roles, with submarines hunting their hunters, demoralized Japanese escort crews and created reluctance to engage contacts aggressively. The predator-prey relationship had reversed completely. The strategic blindness, Japanese naval leadership, confronted with mounting evidence of systematic submarine warfare, struggled to adapt strategies built around decisive fleet engagement. Admiral Nagano Osami, Chief of Naval General Staff, continued prioritizing battleship and carrier construction while merchant losses exceeded 100,000 tons monthly. The fundamental assumption that defeating the American Pacific Fleet would end the submarine threat prevented recognition that commerce destruction had become the primary American strategy, not a secondary harassment campaign. Intelligence analysis remained trapped in pre-war frameworks that obscured the revolution occurring beneath the Pacific's surface. Reports documented increasing submarine contacts and merchant losses but failed to recognize the systematic nature of American operations. Japanese analysts continued expecting American submarines to concentrate against fleet targets, preparing for convoy battles that would never occur, while ignoring the methodical destruction of Japan's economic infrastructure, proceeding unimpeded across vast ocean areas. The industrial implications became undeniable as critical materials simply stopped arriving at Japanese ports. Bauxite from the Dutch East Indies, essential for aircraft production, disappeared from supply schedules as submarines thematically targeted or carriers. Rubber shipments from Southeast Asia ceased entirely after submarines destroyed the specialized tanker fleet required for latex transport. Most critically, oil imports from Borneo and Sumatra dropped to 20% of required levels as American submarines focused increasingly on high-value petroleum targets. Strategic planning sessions in Tokyo revealed the growing desperation as staff officers grappled with logistics networks collapsing faster than defensive measures could be implemented. The Army demanded shipping allocations that no longer existed, while industrial ministries reported production shortfalls caused by missing raw materials. The submarine war had evolved beyond military action into economic strangulation, precisely the strategy Japanese naval doctrine had dismissed as impossible to sustain over Pacific distances. The breaking point, winter 1943. By December 1943, the impossible had become undeniable reality in Japanese naval headquarters. USS Skate, commanded by Eugene McKinney, completed a 90-day patrol that covered over 20,000 miles while destroying 11 merchant vessels without suffering a single successful attack from Japanese anti-submarine forces. The patrol duration exceeded Japanese submarine capabilities by 3 months, demonstrating underwater endurance that shattered every assumption about submarine warfare limitations. The implications cascaded through Japan's military hierarchy as senior officers confronted evidence they could no longer rationalize or dismiss. American submarines weren't conducting brief raids against military targets, but systematic campaigns of economic destruction that threatened Japan's ability to sustain the war effort. Intelligence reports documented submarine contacts from the Kurils to the Coral Sea, indicating coordinated operations across the entire Pacific theater rather than isolated attacks by individual boats. Captain Abe Toshiro, head of anti-submarine operations, presented increasingly desperate assessments to Naval General Staff meetings throughout the winter. His charts showed American submarine patrol areas expanding steadily toward Japanese home waters, with contact frequency increasing despite expanded escort efforts. The enemy boats weren't retreating after initial successes, but establishing permanent hunting grounds that Japanese forces seemed powerless to clear. Traditional naval strategy offered no solutions for combating an enemy that refused decisive engagement while systematically destroying Japan's maritime lifeline. The desperate response. Recognition of the submarine threat finally forced fundamental changes in Japanese naval priorities, but the response came too late and with insufficient resources. Emergency anti-submarine construction programs launched in early 1944 aimed to build 400 escort vessels within 18 months, but material shortages and competing military priorities limited actual production to fewer than 100 hulls. The shipbuilding capacity that might have provided adequate anti-submarine forces had already been committed to aircraft carriers and battleships that could no longer reach their operational areas due to fuel shortages. Training programs underwent radical revision as Japanese naval schools finally acknowledged the specialized skills required for effective submarine hunting. New curricula emphasized acoustic tracking, depth charge tactics, and coordinated search patterns that had been standard practice in Allied navies since 1917. But the crash training programs couldn't overcome decades of doctrinal neglect, and newly graduated anti-submarine officers arrived at sea commands with theoretical knowledge but no practical experience against the seasoned American crews who had perfected their tactics through 2 years of combat operations. Technology development accelerated frantically as Japanese engineers attempted to close the detection gap that allowed American submarines to operate with virtual impunity. Advanced sonar systems, magnetic anomaly detectors, and improved depth charges entered production schedules, but manufacturing delays and quality control problems prevented deployment until mid-1944. When the equipment finally reached operational units, American submarine commanders had already adapted their tactics to exploit the limitations of even the most advanced Japanese detection systems. The final calculations. The numbers that emerged from Japanese naval intelligence during the spring of 1944 revealed the full magnitude of the strategic disaster unfolding beneath Pacific waters. American submarines had destroyed over 600 Japanese merchant vessels totaling more than 2.7 million tons of shipping, while losing only 19 boats to all causes. The exchange ratio approached 30-1 in favor of the attackers, a level of tactical dominance unprecedented in naval warfare history. More devastating than the raw tonnage figures were the qualitative losses that couldn't be replaced. Experienced merchant marine officers, essential for navigating the complex sea lanes between Japan's scattered territories, had perished at rates exceeding 50% annually. Specialized vessels like refrigerated cargo ships, tankers, and ore carriers required years to construct and represented irreplaceable links in Japan's industrial supply chain. Their destruction created bottlenecks that amplified throughout the Japanese war economy, causing shortages far beyond the simple tonnage calculations suggested. The strategic implications extended beyond immediate material losses to fundamental questions about Japan's ability to continue the war. Oil imports reduced to 15% of 1941 levels, forced curtailment of naval operations and aircraft training programs. Food imports dropped so severely that civilian rationing reached starvation levels in major cities. Industrial production declined across all sectors as raw materials simply stopped arriving at manufacturing centers. The submarine campaign had achieved what conventional bombing and surface warfare couldn't accomplish: the systematic strangulation of Japan's war-making capacity. Japanese naval leadership, finally comprehending the nature of the threat they faced, attempted desperate reorganization of defensive priorities. Convoy systems, previously dismissed as unnecessary impediments to maritime efficiency, were hastily implemented using escort vessels diverted from fleet duties. Air patrols over merchant shipping routes increased dramatically despite fuel shortages that grounded training flights. Anti-submarine warfare, relegated to secondary status since the war's beginning, suddenly received top priority in resource allocation and strategic planning. But the fundamental reality remained unchanged. American submarines had gained tactical and technological superiority that Japanese countermeasures couldn't overcome. The patient predators lurking beneath Pacific waters had demonstrated capabilities that Japanese naval doctrine declared impossible, achieving strategic effects through methodical application of underwater warfare principles that Japan's military hierarchy had never seriously studied. The empire that ruled the Pacific surface had lost control of its depths, and with that loss came the inevitable collapse of everything dependent on maritime transportation. The war would continue for another 18 months, but the decisive campaign had already been fought and won in the vast underwater battlefields where Japanese commanders never imagined American submarines could operate with such devastating effectiveness. The maritime collapse. By spring 1944, Japan's merchant marine had entered an irreversible death spiral that no amount of emergency construction could arrest. The statistics painted a picture of systematic destruction that exceeded even the most pessimistic pre-war projections. American submarines had reduced Japan's merchant fleet from 6.4 million tons to fewer than 2.1 million tons of operational shipping, while simultaneously destroying the infrastructure necessary to maintain even this reduced capacity. Dry docks lay empty not from lack of damaged vessels but from absence of ships to repair. The qualitative destruction proved even more devastating than raw tonnage losses. Specialized vessels that had taken years to design and construct disappeared within weeks of entering service. The ore carrier Nisho Maru, specifically built to transport bauxite from the Dutch East Indies, survived exactly 11 days before USS Flasher sent her to the bottom with 8,000 tons of aluminum ore. The refrigerated transport Awamaru, essential for food distribution throughout the Pacific territories, lasted 6 weeks before USS Queenfish intercepted her off Formosa. These weren't random losses, but systematic targeting of Japan's most critical maritime assets. Personnel losses compounded the material devastation in ways that Japanese planners had never anticipated. Master mariners, navigation specialists, and experienced chief engineers died at rates approaching 70% annually as submarines specifically targeted passenger accommodations and bridge structures. Training programs, already strained by wartime demands, could replace decades of accumulated expertise lost with each sinking. Merchant vessels that survived submarine attacks often ran aground or suffered navigation errors because inexperienced crews lacked the skills necessary for wartime operations in hostile waters. The psychological impact on surviving merchant marine crews created additional operational difficulties that Japanese authorities struggled to address. Sailors who had witnessed systematic destruction of entire convoys developed what medical officers termed submarine neurosis, an inability to function effectively under the constant threat of underwater attack. Recruitment for merchant service virtually ceased as word spread through maritime communities about the lethal efficiency of American submarine operations. Even impressed civilian sailors frequently deserted at ports, preferring military punishment to certain death aboard defenseless cargo vessels. Industrial strangulation, the carefully orchestrated industrial system that sustained Japan's war effort, began collapsing as critical materials simply stopped arriving at manufacturing centers. Aircraft production, dependent on aluminum ingots from Southeast Asian bauxite mines, dropped 60% by mid-1944 as ore carriers fell victim to systematic submarine attacks. Steel production declined even more dramatically as iron ore shipments from China and the Philippines became increasingly irregular, forcing blast furnaces to shut down for lack of raw materials. Oil refining capacity, already strained by pre-war expansion demands, became meaningless as crude petroleum imports virtually ceased. The sophisticated cracking plants built to process Dutch East Indies crude sat idle while Japanese cities implemented blackout measures to conserve dwindling fuel stocks. Aviation gasoline, essential for training new pilots, became so scarce that flight schools reduced instruction time to barely adequate levels. Naval operations, once characterized by aggressive fleet movements across vast Pacific distances, contracted to defensive positions close to home waters where fuel consumption could be minimized. Food distribution networks that had supplied Japan's urban populations for decades collapsed under the strain of transportation shortages. Rice imports from Korea and Southeast Asia, traditionally managed through predictable shipping schedules, became sporadic gambles that frequently resulted in entire cargoes disappearing without trace. Fishing fleets, previously operated with peacetime efficiency, required military escorts that weren't available for other essential missions. Civilian rationing systems, initially implemented as temporary wartime measures, evolved into permanent starvation protocols as agricultural imports dropped below subsistence levels. The synthetic mate. Ryle's program, launched with great fanfare to reduce dependence on imported raw materials, proved completely inadequate for replacing lost maritime capacity. Artificial rubber production, despite massive investment in research and manufacturing facilities, never exceeded 15% of military requirements. Substitute metals and alloys, while technically feasible in laboratory conditions, couldn't be mass-produced with sufficient quality for aircraft engines or naval construction. Japan's industrial economy, built around imported materials and exported finished goods, simply couldn't function when submarine warfare severed the maritime connections that sustained the entire system. Strategic adaptation failures. Japanese military leadership, confronted with undeniable evidence of maritime collapse, attempted strategic adaptations that revealed how completely submarine warfare had disrupted their operational planning. The combined fleet, designed for aggressive operations across the Pacific, found itself increasingly constrained to defensive positions where fuel consumption and logistical demands could be minimized. Aircraft carrier operations, the foundation of Japanese naval strategy, became impossible to sustain as aviation gasoline shortages grounded entire air groups. Convoy operations, hastily implemented using escort vessels diverted from fleet duties, proved woefully inadequate against experienced American submarine crews who had perfected tactics specifically designed to defeat such defensive measures. The few available destroyers and frigates, spread across impossibly vast ocean areas, provided minimal protection for merchant vessels that still traveled predictable routes at economical speeds. American submarines learned to exploit the rigid convoy schedules, positioning themselves along known shipping lanes and attacking with virtual impunity. The Army's Pacific garrison strategy collapsed as supply ships simply stopped arriving at remote island bases. Troops on bypassed islands, originally intended to tie down American forces through prolonged resistance, found themselves abandoned without ammunition, medical supplies, or food shipments. The elaborate defensive preparations on strategic islands became meaningless when the garrisons couldn't be sustained through maritime transportation. Military planners, accustomed to moving divisions across ocean distances on predictable schedules, discovered that submarine warfare had made such operations impossible to execute or even plan with any confidence. Intelligence gathering and strategic communication suffered equally severe disruption as submarines targeted vessels carrying coded messages, technical specialists, and liaison officers between scattered commands. The coordination mechanisms that allowed Japan to manage military operations across the Pacific theater began failing as key personnel and essential information disappeared beneath the waves, along with the ships that carried them. The human cost. The merchant marine casualties that accumulated through 1944 and 1945 represented more than statistical abstractions to families across Japan who watched sons, fathers, and hers disappear into the Pacific's depths. Maritime communities that had sustained Japan's island economy for generations found themselves devastated by losses that exceeded those of frontline infantry units. In ports like Yokohama and Kobe, entire neighborhoods emptied as merchant families fled inland, abandoning homes that had sheltered seafaring generations since the Meiji Restoration. The ripple effects extended far beyond immediate families as communities dependent on maritime commerce faced economic collapse. Shipbuilding centers like Sasebo and Kure, once bustling with construction activity, became ghost towns as orders ceased and workers dispersed to seek employment in war industries. The skilled craftsmen who had built Japan's merchant fleet possessed expertise that couldn't be quickly transferred to other occupations, creating unemployment and social disruption that persisted long after the war's end. Children in coastal communities grew up without fathers, uncles, or older brothers as submarine warfare claimed entire extended families involved in maritime trades. The psychological trauma extended beyond individual loss to collective cultural destruction as Japan's seafaring traditions, passed down through generations of merchant sailors, simply vanished with the men who embodied them. Fishing villages that had operated for centuries found themselves unable to continue traditional practices as experienced captains and navigators died aboard requisitioned vessels pressed into military service. Medical facilities in major ports struggled to treat survivors of submarine attacks who arrived with injuries unlike anything encountered in conventional warfare. Burns from exploding fuel tanks, crushing injuries from torpedo impacts, and psychological trauma from prolonged exposure to underwater explosions created treatment challenges that overwhelmed hospital staffs already strained by military casualties. Many survivors suffered permanent disabilities that prevented return to maritime service, further depleting Japan's already decimated merchant marine expertise. The economic unraveling, Japan's sophisticated financial systems built around predictable commodity flows and manufacturing schedules, began failing as submarine warfare eliminated the economic predictability that sustained complex commercial relationships. Insurance companies, faced with merchant marine losses exceeding 90% on certain routes, simply stopped providing coverage for maritime commerce. Banks that had financed shipping operations and cargo purchases found themselves holding worthless paper as vessels and cargoes disappeared without generating revenue to service debt obligations. Currency stability, maintained through careful management of export earnings and import costs, collapsed as the fundamental trade relationships that supported Japanese monetary policy ceased to function. The yen's international exchange value plummeted as foreign trading partners recognized that Japanese promises to deliver goods couldn't be fulfilled when the vessels carrying those goods were being systematically destroyed. International credit arrangements, essential for purchasing strategic materials, became impossible to negotiate as Japan's reputation for commercial reliability evaporated along with her merchant fleet. Regional economies throughout the Pacific territories faced complete collapse as the transportation networks that connected them to Japanese industrial centers simply disappeared. Taiwan's sugar production, the Philippines' mineral extraction, and Southeast Asia's agricultural surplus became economically worthless when ships couldn't reliably transport these goods to markets. Local populations, initially impressed into Japanese economic systems through military occupation, found themselves abandoned as submarine warfare made colonial exploitation logistically impossible. The black market economy that emerged in Japan's major cities reflected the fundamental breakdown of normal commercial distribution. Goods that had once moved freely through established channels became rare commodities available only through illegal trading networks. Rice, previously imported in predictable quantities through government-controlled shipping, sold for prices that exceeded monthly wages as supplies became sporadic and uncertain. Consumer goods that had defined Japanese middle-class life disappeared entirely as the industrial capacity to produce them was redirected toward feudal military needs. The final realization. By early 1945, even the most optimistic Japanese naval planners could no longer deny that submarine warfare had achieved what conventional military forces couldn't accomplish: the complete severing of Japan's connection to the resources that sustained modern industrial society. Intelligence reports documented the presence of American submarines in every major shipping lane, operating with impunity despite desperate attempts to provide convoy protection. The underwater enemy had achieved total sea control through methodical application of principles that Japanese naval doctrine had dismissed as impossible. The strategic implications extended beyond immediate military considerations to existential questions about Japan's survival as an industrial nation. Without maritime transportation, the island empire couldn't access the raw materials necessary for basic manufacturing. Without manufactured goods, Japan couldn't generate the export earnings required to purchase food imports. The entire economic cycle that sustained 60 million people had been broken by an enemy operating beneath the waves with capabilities that Japanese commanders had never imagined possible. Military resistance, while continuing through stubborn pride and institutional momentum, became increasingly meaningless as the industrial base necessary to sustain armed forces simply ceased to function. Aircraft production dropped to negligible levels as aluminum supplies disappeared. Ammunition manufacturing declined as explosives couldn't be produced without imported chemicals. Even basic military supplies like uniforms and boots became scarce as textile imports from Southeast Asia ceased entirely. The emperor's decision to surrender in August 1945, while immediately triggered by atomic weapons and Soviet entry into the war, reflected the deeper reality that submarine warfare had already rendered continued resistance impossible. Japan could no longer feed her people, supply her military forces, or maintain the industrial capacity necessary for modern warfare. The patient predators lurking beneath Pacific waters had achieved strategic victory through systematic application of underwater warfare principles that had evolved far beyond Japanese comprehension or ability to counter. The greatest naval power in the Pacific, the empire that had dominated Asian waters for half a century, had been defeated not by enemy battleships or aircraft carriers, but by submarines whose capabilities exceeded every assumption upon which Japanese naval strategy had been constructed. The war above the waves continued for symbolic and political reasons, but the decisive campaign had been fought and won in the depths where Japanese commanders never imagined their enemies could operate with such devastating effectiveness for such extended periods. The silence that settled over Tokyo Bay in September 1945 carried echoes of decisions made in distant offices 3 years earlier, when confident admirals dismissed American submarine capabilities based on assumptions that would prove catastrophically wrong. The surrender ceremony aboard USS Missouri took place in waters where Japanese naval supremacy had once seemed absolute, yet the decisive battles had been fought not by surface fleets, but by submarines whose endurance and persistence exceeded every calculation made by Japan's finest strategic minds. The tragedy of Japanese anti-submarine warfare lay not in individual failures of courage or competence, but in the institutional blindness that prevented recognition of a revolutionary form of warfare until far too late. Officers trained in the traditions of Tsushima, educated in the principles of decisive fleet engagement, simply couldn't comprehend an enemy that would spend months stalking merchant vessels with the patience of apex predators. When Admiral Komatsu had closed that intelligence folder in January 1942, satisfied with assessments of American submarine limitations, he embodied a worldview that would cost Japan her empire. The lessons transcended naval warfare to illuminate the dangers of strategic assumptions left unexamined. Every military doctrine, however successful in past conflicts, carries within it the seeds of future defeat if it becomes too rigid to accommodate enemy innovation. The Japanese Navy's fixation on surface battle, logical given their historical experience, blinded them to underwater threats that would prove far more decisive than any conventional engagement. Their submarines operated as fleet auxiliaries because that's how submarines had always operated. The possibility that American boats might function as independent commerce raiders simply didn't register in minds focused on traditional naval combat. The human cost of this institutional failure extended far beyond military casualties to encompass entire communities dependent on maritime commerce. Merchant sailors who died aboard defenseless cargo ships paid the price for strategic decisions made by officers who never understood the nature of the war they were fighting. The children who grew up without fathers, the coastal villages that emptied as seafaring families fled inland, the industrial workers who starved as raw materials stopped arriving, all suffered from a failure of imagination at the highest levels of Japanese naval command. History remembers World War II's Pacific theater for its aircraft carrier battles and amphibious assaults, but the war's outcome was determined in the depths where patient American submarines systematically strangled Japan's ability to sustain modern industrial civilization. The empire that ruled the Pacific surface lost control of its depths, and with that loss came the inevitable collapse of everything dependent on the maritime connections that bound Japan's scattered territories into a functioning economic unit. The fog that had lifted from Tokyo Bay that January morning in 1942 revealed calm waters that concealed revolutionary changes already transforming naval warfare forever. Japanese commanders, confident in their understanding of submarine limitations, never imagined that beneath those peaceful surfaces lurked predators capable of remaining submerged for entire months, systematically destroying the maritime empire that had taken generations to construct.